The email wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Just another request, another interview, another show. But this wasn't just any show. And Karoline Leavitt knew it the moment she saw the sender's name. The Franklin Hour. Her finger hovered over the screen. The subject line read, "Exclusive invitation, primetime broadcast." She exhaled slowly. She had seen what happened to others who walked into that studio. They didn't just debate. They were set up, dismantled, turned into viral clips where they never got the last word. Graham Franklin was a master at it. A seasoned host with years of experience, he had built his empire on trapping his guests, twisting their words, making them look foolish in front of millions. His audience didn't watch for discussions, they watched for takedowns. Karoline had faced tough interviews before, but this was different. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. Tom, her media advisor. "You're not actually considering this, are you?" His voice was tense. "Franklin doesn't interview people, Karoline. He sets them up to fail." She leaned back in her chair, staring at the email. A primetime slot, a live audience, millions watching. It was the kind of exposure most people dreamed of. But she wasn't naive. She knew exactly what this was. A carefully laid trap. She tapped her fingers on the desk, thinking. The safe move was to decline. Avoid the setup, sidestep the ambush, stay in control of her own message. But that's not why she was here. She had spent years calling out media bias, fighting back against narratives designed to silence voices like hers. If she backed down now, she'd be proving them right, that conservatives were too afraid to step onto their battlefield. Her grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not worried about Franklin," she said, voice steady. "I'm worried about whether people will actually listen." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Tom sighed. "Then we better get you ready." For the next few days, her team drilled every angle. Mock debates, strategy meetings, endless counterarguments. They studied Franklin's tricks, his sarcastic tone, his habit of interrupting right before his guests made a strong point, the way he'd twist a sentence into a soundbite that made the headlines instead of the actual conversation. She knew his game inside out, but even the best preparation couldn't predict everything. The night of the interview arrived faster than she expected. As she stepped out of the car in front of the studio, the weight of what was coming settled over her. The cameras, the audience, the trap. Producers shuffled inside, speaking in hushed tones. Someone handed her a mic pack without making eye contact. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone in the room expected to watch Franklin tear her apart. Karoline straightened her shoulders. They had no idea what was coming. She wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to flip the script. The studio doors slid open, and Karoline stepped inside. The air felt thick, charged with an energy she had sensed before. Expectation, curiosity, and something else. Anticipation. Crew members moved around with quiet urgency, their eyes flicking toward her, then away just as fast. Some whispered to each other, avoiding direct glances. She wasn't just another guest. They knew tonight would be different. A young producer, barely acknowledging her, handed her a mic pack. "You're up in 5, he muttered, already turning away. The message was clear, no warm welcomes, no small talk. She was here for a show, nothing more. She adjusted the mic, her hands steady. The hum of the crowd echoed through the walls. The audience was already excited, their voices blending into a restless buzz. She walked toward the stage entrance, where a crew member waited with an earpiece. "Franklin is wrapping up his monologue," he said. "Be ready." Karoline nodded. Ready wasn't the problem. This wasn't about preparation anymore, it was about execution. Beyond the curtain, Graham Franklin's voice carried through the studio speakers, smooth and confident. His opening remarks were laced with sarcasm, setting the stage for what he thought would be another easy takedown. The audience laughed at his carefully placed jabs, their reactions automatic, almost rehearsed. They weren't just watching a debate, they were part of the act. Karoline glanced at the floor manager, who held up 3 fingers. 3 minutes. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the moment. She had seen this pattern before. An overconfident host, a crowd eager for entertainment, and a guest who never saw the trap until it was too late. But tonight, the script wouldn't play out the way they expected. A red light blinked near the stage entrance. 2 minutes. Franklin's voice sharpened as he set the tone. He described her in a way that framed her before she even spoke. Outspoken, controversial, a figure who claims to fight for the truth. Every word was chosen carefully, planting seeds before she could say a single thing. The audience responded right on cue, murmuring and chuckling. 1 minute, the tension thickened. A stagehand motioned her forward. The applause started before she even stepped out, but it wasn't for her. It was for Franklin. His audience was conditioned to celebrate him before the conversation even began. Karoline stepped onto the stage, her steps measured, her face unreadable. Franklin stood at the center, waiting, a practiced smirk on his face. "Karoline Leavitt," he said, extending a hand. "Brave of you to come." The audience chuckled, catching the underlying dig. Karoline met his gaze, shook his hand, and took her seat. The moment she sat down, she felt it. The weight of the room shifting, the silent anticipation thickening in the air. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Franklin leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie with a casual air. His smile was polite, but his eyes held something else, expectation. He was waiting for the moment to strike. "Karoline, welcome," he said smoothly, resting his hands on the desk. "Brave of you to come." The audience chuckled. It was meant to sound like a compliment, but everyone in the room knew what it really was. The first jab. Karoline gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. Franklin wasted no time. "You've said before that conservative voices are being silenced. And yet, here you are on one of the biggest shows in the country, speaking to millions. How do you explain that contradiction?" The audience clapped, some nodding in agreement. Franklin's smirk grew. He had framed the question perfectly, putting her on the defensive right from the start. Karoline didn't hesitate. She folded her hands on the desk, her voice steady. "Being invited doesn't mean getting a fair conversation. It just means being used as entertainment." The room shifted. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances. Franklin's smirk didn't fade, but his fingers tapped lightly against the table. "Entertainment?" he echoed, feigning curiosity. "So, you think this is all just a game?" Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Not for me. But let's be honest, your audience expects a certain outcome. They're here to watch you prove a point, not to hear a real discussion." The murmuring grew. Franklin's eyes flicked toward the crowd for a brief second before he continued. "That's quite the claim," he said. "Are you saying I don't allow honest conversations on my show?" Karoline met his gaze without blinking. "I'm saying there's a pattern." Franklin leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie with a casual air. His smile was polite, but his eyes held something else, expectation. He was waiting for the moment to strike. "Karoline, welcome," he said smoothly, resting his hands on the desk. "Brave of you to come." The audience chuckled. It was meant to sound like a compliment, but everyone in the room knew what it really was. The first jab. Karoline gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. Franklin wasted no time. "You've said before that conservative voices are being silenced. And yet, here you are on one of the biggest shows in the country, speaking to millions. How do you explain that contradiction?" The audience clapped, some nodding in agreement. Franklin's smirk grew. He had framed the question perfectly, putting her on the defensive right from the start. Karoline didn't hesitate. She folded her hands on the desk, her voice steady. "Being invited doesn't mean getting a fair conversation. It just means being used as entertainment." The room shifted. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances. Franklin's smirk didn't fade, but his fingers tapped lightly against the table. "Entertainment?" he echoed, feigning curiosity. "So, you think this is all just a game?" Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Not for me. But let's be honest, your audience expects a certain outcome. They're here to watch you prove a point, not to hear a real discussion." The murmuring grew. Franklin's eyes flicked toward the crowd for a brief second before he continued. "That's quite the claim," he said. "Are you saying I don't allow honest conversations on my show?" Karoline met his gaze without blinking. "I'm saying there's a pattern." Franklin chuckled, shaking his head. "A pattern?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying an edge of amusement. "All right, let's hear it. What's this so-called pattern?" Karoline didn't flinch. "You bring on conservative guests, cut them off, reframe their words, and by the time they leave, the only thing people remember is your monologue." A noticeable pause filled the air. The audience, which had been quick to laugh moments ago, was quieter now. Franklin raised an eyebrow, the smile on his lips still present but tighter than before. "So, you're accusing me of twisting narratives?" Karoline's tone remained calm. "I don't have to accuse you. Your clips speak for themselves." The shift in the room was undeniable. Franklin exhaled through his nose, adjusting the papers in front of him. "All right," he said, his voice measured. "If you're so sure about that, let's talk about truth." Karoline nodded. "Let's." Franklin picked up a sheet of paper, glancing at the audience as if setting up his next move. "You once said, and I quote, 'The mainstream media would rather push propaganda than admit the facts.' Do you really believe that? Or is that just something you say to rile people up?" He set the paper down and leaned back, waiting. Karoline remained steady. "I believe the facts speak for themselves." Franklin's fingers drummed against the desk. "All right, let's be specific. How many times has this network had to retract a story in the last 2 years?" For the first time, Franklin didn't respond immediately. He glanced at his notes, flipping a page as if looking for something, but he didn't have the number. Karoline didn't wait. "Or better yet," she continued, "how often does a false narrative get spread, only for the correction to be buried where no one will see it?" The audience murmured again. Franklin's jaw tightened just slightly before he plastered on another smirk. "So now you're saying the media is deliberately misleading people?" Karoline gave a small shrug. "I'm saying priorities shape perception. The stories that fit a certain message get front-page treatment. The ones that don't, they get sidelined." Franklin inhaled, the amusement in his face forced now. The conversation wasn't going the way he had planned. The crowd, once fully on his side, was now watching him just as closely as they were watching her. The trap he had set wasn't working, and he knew it. Franklin leaned forward slightly, shifting the papers in front of him. His usual confidence remained, but there was a hint of something else now, restraint. The conversation wasn't unfolding the way he had planned, and he knew he had to regain control. His tone was casual, almost playful. "All right, Karoline, let's clear something up. You often claim that the mainstream media pushes propaganda instead of facts. That's a strong accusation. Do you really believe that? Or is it just a convenient talking point?" The audience chuckled, sensing another moment where Franklin would put his guest in a tough spot. Karoline didn't hesitate. "I believe facts speak for themselves. How many times has this network had to retract a story in the last 2 years?" The reaction in the room shifted. The laughter faded. A few people in the audience turned to each other, waiting for Franklin's response. He tapped his fingers lightly against the desk. "Interesting deflection," he said, tilting his head. "But that's not what I asked." Karoline remained calm. "It's not a deflection. It's the core of the issue. The media pushes narratives, and when those narratives fall apart, the corrections never get the same attention." Franklin's jaw tightened slightly. He exhaled, a small forced chuckle escaping. "So now you're saying the entire industry is corrupt?" Karoline shook her head. "I never said that, but you're doing it again, reframing my words instead of addressing what I actually said." A murmur moved through the audience. Franklin noticed it. His eyes flicked toward the producers for a split second before he pressed forward. "Okay, let's test your version of truth," he said, flipping a page in his notes. "You once tweeted that the media and government work together to suppress inconvenient truths. That's quite a claim. Sounds a lot like a conspiracy theory, doesn't it?" He leaned back in his chair, waiting for her to stumble. But Karoline didn't blink. "It's not a conspiracy if there's proof." Franklin smirked. "Proof?" Karoline nodded. "Public records, internal emails, leaked documents. They all confirm what many suspected. The government has pressured tech companies to control the flow of information." The room was silent. Even the most eager audience members weren't laughing now. Franklin cleared his throat. "And yet, the biggest media outlets in the country don't report it the way you do. Why do you think that is?" Karoline met his gaze, her voice even. "Because they benefit from it." The air in the studio changed. A shift in energy, subtle but undeniable. Franklin's smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. He adjusted his tie, reaching for another sheet of paper. "So now you're telling us that thousands of journalists across multiple networks are all in on some grand scheme?" Karoline gave a small smile, almost amused. "You're proving my point in real time." Franklin blinked. "Excuse me?" She gestured slightly. "I never said every journalist. But instead of discussing the facts, you're making it sound like I believe in some shadowy cabal in a dark room. That's how you control conversations, not by disproving arguments, but by making the person presenting them seem ridiculous." Another murmur moved through the audience. Franklin sat up straighter, glancing at his notes as if searching for something stronger. He inhaled sharply. "All right, let's move on to something everyone can agree on," he said, shifting tactics. "Let's talk about January 6th. The audience stirred. Karoline saw the trap before he even finished. This was always the fallback, the moment where conservative guests were backed into a corner. Either they fully condemned their own side, or they were painted as extremists. A no-win situation. Franklin adjusted his glasses. "You've criticized the media's coverage of that day. So let's be clear. Do you believe it was an insurrection?" Karoline's face remained calm. "I believe violence is wrong. I believe political violence is wrong, whether it happens in a federal building, outside a courthouse, or on city streets." Franklin's smirk returned. "That's a nice rehearsed answer, but it's not what I asked." Karoline held his gaze. "I answered the question. You just don't like the answer." For the first time, Franklin hesitated. The crowd wasn't laughing anymore. Some were leaning in, watching him instead of her. He exhaled through his nose, tapping his notes on the desk. The control he once had over the conversation was slipping, and Karoline knew it. Franklin's grip on the conversation was slipping, and he knew it. The usual rhythm of his show, where he controlled the pace, the tone, and the narrative, was falling apart in front of a live audience. He shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping rapidly against the desk. His confidence, once effortless, now seemed forced. The crowd, once eager to cheer him on, had grown quieter. Some leaned forward, sensing something different about this exchange. He adjusted his tie and let out a short, measured breath. "All right, Karoline, let's get real. You talk about media bias, about narratives being controlled. But let's not pretend you're some neutral figure. You've built your career doing the exact same thing, pushing a one-sided agenda." A few audience members clapped, relieved that Franklin had finally landed a hit. He straightened, regaining some of his earlier ease. Karoline simply tilted her head. "So, let me get this straight. When I challenge the media's framing, it's an agenda. But when networks spend months pushing false stories, that's just journalism." Franklin exhaled through his nose, a tight smile forming. "Oh, come on. You act like some kind of victim when in reality, you're just another talking head pushing propaganda." Silence. The room, once buzzing with energy, froze. The audience, the staff, even Franklin himself. Everyone felt it. The words had left his mouth before he could catch them. His eyes flickered, his jaw locking for a brief second. He had never lost his temper on air before. Not like this. Karoline didn't move. She didn't need to. She simply raised an eyebrow, letting the silence stretch. A few murmurs ran through the crowd, but they weren't on Franklin's side anymore. They were processing what just happened. The control was gone. Franklin shifted in his seat, gripping the edge of his desk, his face unreadable. He cleared his throat and forced a chuckle. Well, that was a lively response. Nobody laughed. A sharp voice suddenly cut through Karoline's earpiece. "We're going to commercial." The studio lights dimmed slightly. The theme music played, but the usual energy was missing. Franklin barely nodded before the cameras cut away. The moment they were off air, he ripped off his earpiece and threw it onto the desk. "What the hell was that?" he muttered under his breath. Producers scrambled around him. One leaned down, whispering urgently. Another turned toward the control room, gesturing frantically. Karoline remained in her seat, completely still. A production assistant hesitantly approached. "Miss Leavitt, would you like some water?" She shook her head. "I'm fine." She wasn't the one who needed it. Behind Franklin, his staff whispered in hushed, panicked voices. She caught snippets. "Twitter is blowing up. We need to fix this. Do we pivot?" Franklin rubbed a hand down his face, his breathing shallow. He was trying to regain composure, but the damage was done. And he knew it. The cameras had barely cut to commercial when the internet erupted. Within minutes, the clip of Franklin's outburst was everywhere. Twitter was the first to catch fire. "Did Franklin just completely lose it on live TV?" One post read. "Never seen him this rattled before." Another user added, "She got under his skin bad." The video spread like wildfire. Facebook groups, political pages, and news accounts shared it with captions ranging from, "This is why people don't trust the media," to, "When the debate doesn't go as planned." On YouTube, reaction videos flooded in. Some praised Karoline's composure, others mocked Franklin's meltdown. The comment sections filled with debates, arguments, and countless jokes. And then came the memes. A screenshot of Franklin's stunned expression, mid-outburst, quickly made rounds with captions like, "When you realize you're not in control anymore," and "Franklin after years of running the show his way." A slowed-down gif of Karoline's calm, almost amused reaction played side by side with Franklin's frustrated glare. The moment he knew he lost, one caption read, "News outlets jumped on the chaos," each spinning their own version of events. Some painted Franklin as passionate, others called him unprofessional. The most brutal headlines didn't hold back. Talk show host loses cool as guest turns the tables. Graham Franklin cracks under pressure, his worst interview yet. Karoline Leavitt exposes media bias in real time. By the time the show returned from commercial, the damage had been done. Franklin's usual confidence was there, but the energy in the room had shifted. The audience wasn't as lively. The atmosphere felt heavier. Later that night, Franklin's PR team scrambled to contain the fallout. A statement was posted on his show's official account. "Last night's interview with Karoline Leavitt was a spirited discussion. While I stand by my tough questioning, I regret that I let my frustration show. I believe in challenging conversations and welcome opposing viewpoints. The internet wasn't buying it." Translation: "I lost my cool and now I'm pretending I meant to." One user wrote, "He didn't let frustration show. He snapped because he wasn't in control." Another added, "Karoline, meanwhile, remained silent. She didn't need to say anything. The internet had already decided the narrative. And this time, it wasn't in Franklin's favor." By the next morning, the interview was everywhere. News cycles ran segments, online discussions raged, and opinion writers picked apart every second of the exchange. But this was no longer about a single moment on live television. Something deeper had happened. For years, talk shows like Franklin's had shaped public opinion, deciding which voices were heard and which were dismissed. They controlled the pace, framed the questions, and cut off discussions before they could challenge the status quo. The audience had been conditioned to accept this as normal. But this time, they saw something different. People weren't just reacting to Franklin's frustration. They were questioning why it happened in the first place. Why did he lose control? Why did a guest calmly stating facts shake him so badly? And most importantly, if the media was truly neutral, why did challenging it feel so dangerous? Comments flooded in across platforms. Some from conservatives who had long pointed out media bias. Others from moderates and even skeptics who had never given it much thought before. "I don't even agree with her, but she handled that better than most politicians." Why does questioning the media make people so uncomfortable? I used to respect Franklin, but seeing him panic like that makes me wonder how much control he really has. This was the shift. People weren't just reacting, they were reevaluating. It wasn't about one debate or one bad interview. It was about how narratives were shaped and who got to control them. Franklin's team had hoped the internet would move on, that the story would fade, that people would forget. But some moments don't disappear, because once people see through the game, they never look at it the same way again. The interview ended, but the conversation had just begun. People weren't just talking about what happened, they were questioning what it meant. It wasn't about Franklin's frustration or Karoline's composure. It was about something much bigger. For too long, discussions had been controlled by those who decided which voices mattered and which ones didn't. Conversations were shaped, narratives were molded, and certain viewpoints were pushed aside. But that control wasn't as strong as it once was. Now, the audience wasn't just listening. They were thinking. They were asking questions. They were seeing what had always been there but had gone unnoticed. This wasn't just about a debate. It was about how truth is handled. And that's why it mattered. Because when people start questioning the way things are presented, they stop accepting them at face value. If this moment proved anything, it was that real conversations aren't as easy to shut down as they used to be. And that should make those in power very nervous. If you took something away from this, don't let it stop here. Think for yourself. Challenge assumptions. Demand real answers. And most of all, never be afraid to speak up. Because the moment people stop questioning, those in control win. And that cannot happen